As I mentioned beforehand, our final one is the minimum riding weights and towards a more individualised and evidence-based approach. I'm reading that because it is quite specific and it's something we're going to try and hone in on. So as before, I'm going to introduce our panellists and we'll give them a round of applause when they do come up. Dr. Jennifer Pugh is the Chief Medical Officer of the Irish Horse Racing Regulatory Board. She's a former champion amateur rider in point of points in Ireland, and she is representing obviously Ireland here today with Rosie Hyman from the UK. She's completing her PhD in the University of Bath, investigating higher rate of subsequent injury after sports-related concussion. We'll see both of them on the concussion panel in the morning. And Rosie is charged with the Individual Minimum Riding Weights project of the BHA. They'll be joined on stage by Andrew Coonan, who is a practicing solicitor. He's involved in the creation of the Irish Jockeys Pension Trust and a former amateur jockey to much success as well, and the Secretary of the Irish Jockeys Association. Paul Struthers, who's the BHA Head of Communications, Chief Executive of the PJA in 2012, a role he returned to in 2024. And joining them as well is Peter Hitchens from Australia, the Director of Equine Orthopaedic Research Group at the University of Melbourne. There are 5 panellists. I will facilitate our final session. So if you could welcome our 5 panellists to the stage, please. Thank you. Welcome. I'm going to begin. Whenever any of us see a jockey being interviewed by mainstream media, almost certainly the same 3 questions are asked. How many injuries have you had? What time did you get up in the morning? And tell us about your diet. They're the 3 go-to questions. That's the 3 I see anyway. Largely because for the rest of the population, we don't like being hurt. We like to sleep as and when we do. And we definitely like to eat when we're hungry. So those are the 3 barometers that seem to hit the mainstream media most when they look at jockeys. That's what I see them ask first. So in this particular conference, as I'm sure with every other minimum weights comes up, or weight making of some shape or form. And I suppose, as I said at the outset today, we're going to look at every topic in the context of where we are in 2025. So I suppose I'm going to begin with Andrew, Paul. If one of you would like to begin and explain to us, over the last number of years, I suppose COVID was a factor, equipment allowances for riders. There have been a number of changes over the last number of years. So from your members' point of view here in 2025, if you'd like to bring us up to date as to how your members find the challenge that has been ever present, I suppose.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So in the UK at least, obviously when COVID hit and when racing came back after the immediate closure following COVID, for infection control purposes, really, we closed the saunas, and in the UK, jockeys used to be able to ride at 9 meetings a week, so could travel to more than 1 race meeting on a given day. And again, for infection control, that was stopped, so they were restricted to 1 meeting a day. Now, the following year, after that had been in place, and the feedback on the saunas being closed and only being able to ride at 1 meeting a day was really positive, because they'd been given an additional £3 weight allowance in addition to the allowance that they got for their body protector. And that was to offset the fact that the saunas had been closed. So we surveyed our members, because we were speaking to the BHA about the potential to retain the restriction on only being able to ride at 1 meeting a day, and also to ask them their opinions on saunas remaining closed, and they were overwhelmingly in favour of retaining the 1 meeting a day restriction. 83% of them wanted to keep it, and 84% of them wanted the saunas to remain closed, but only if the allowance that had been brought in during COVID remained. They were kind of contingent on the 2. Unfortunately, and not a medical decision at all, so it isn't a decision that was taken by Jerry Hill at the BHA, but the typical of racing, it's its own worst enemy. The trainers weren't very happy that jockeys were carrying an additional £3 on their horses, and so complained about it. And the BHA, unfortunately, took the decision to remove the allowance. They made some changes to the weight structure, but I did warn them that, yeah, you think that if you increase the weights of the race by £2, that the jockeys are just going to start taking rides at £2 higher than they normally would. And I knew that wouldn't happen, and it hasn't happened. So what we're in a situation now is, and Rosie will be best to touch on this, there's been a lot of research that's been going on in the last 12 to 18 months. It's kind of 3 facets to it. A literature review in relation to dehydration, and then a mental health study which Katie O'Farrell's carrying out with English and Irish jockeys, and then a study carried out by Liverpool, John Moores, because the jockeys are finding, and this is no criticism of, the saunas were closed in good faith. The jockeys actually supported the closure of the saunas, and it's just unfortunate with what happened elsewhere with the weight allowance. But what we're finding now is that jockeys are spending longer dehydrated than they were. In the UK, again, it's a particularly unique set of circumstances in the UK because we race 362 days a year. And for flat jockeys, they get one break of 10 days and another break of 4 days. We have a shortage of racing staff, so jockeys are required to ride out in the mornings more than they've ever been required. So they're working 7 days a week. They're really time poor. And I think they've reverted post-COVID and post the COVID allowance to a lot of bad practices. But I do understand, as much as it frustrates our members enormously, that we have to be evidence-based, and that's why we are waiting for the results of the research. And I think Rosie will be able to talk a little bit more about that. But I'm also aware that, Andrew, you have a different system in Ireland because you already have the existence of individual minimum riding weights to a degree.
Yeah, that's exactly the situation. I'd echo all of what Paul says insofar as the intention was very good. We had no fault with that, and the reasoning behind the closing of the saunas was very logical at that particular point in time. Where we now find ourselves, though, is in a situation in real time. What we're finding is that we are seeing jockeys reverting back to practices which, to be perfectly honest with you, we thought were gone. A long time ago, and gone because they were very, very unhealthy in many respects. And so we're seeing riders now excessively dehydrating over a long period of time, creating risks for themselves and for others by virtue of the wasting methods that they're using, which thankfully we had moved away from, and that's kind of the big concern. So the jockeys are really struggling with where we are at the moment. How we got there, Paul has, I think, explained it very well. But that's the situation we're now finding ourselves in. We think there's a sweet spot in here, dependent on the results that Rosie's going to talk about, and that is that those saunas should be reopened. And it was interesting that this has already been touched on, and we didn't pay Michael anything to ask that question, by the way. But so we very much think, from the rider's point of view, that the reopening of saunas in certain limited circumstances, and all riders now accept that they can't go back to the reopening of saunas in the old-fashioned way where you get in and just kill yourself and get out and race. I think most riders, the vast majority, would accept that that's probably not the way to go. But the reopening of saunas in a controlled fashion, and by that I'm talking about the use of the minimum riding weight, which unusually, as far back as 2013, I think Adrian did a huge amount of work in introducing that for young riders in Ireland. And we now have a situation. So, 12 years later, we have a situation whereby our last two champions, have come through this regime of minimum riding weight, where this was given to them during their apprenticeship. They worked within that. It was evidence-based. It was using biometrics and all of the various different things like that. And I think that is a very good basis for going forward with the reintroduction of saunas in limited circumstances. And that's where I think we need to be looking at now.
And we might get into the detail of what that might look like, because it's probably easy to describe it, but as we dive deeper into it, there's probably quite an amount of detail. I suppose to go to Jennifer and Rosie, from your point of view, what you've heard there in terms of the jockeys voted for it, but now we've seen different practices. Where do you see from the medical perspective on your side? And Peter, we'll rope you in on this as well. But if you'd like to begin, Jennifer.
Thanks, Richard. I suppose I'm going to go back to the title of this session, which is not when are the saunas reopening, but on individualised minimum riding weights. I think, this is a lot of the change, and where we are now is around the changes we've seen since COVID. But making weight is not new in jockeys. Dehydration, rapid weight loss techniques, unhealthy practices, starvation. None of this is new in jockeys. We go back to times when the bottom weights would have been 7 stone. I think Kevin Ring 712. So we have, as time has gone on, we have seen rises in the weight. We've seen increased supports since COVID. We probably slightly new and slightly different in Ireland. The sauna closure was associated with a 2 pound increase in all of the weights and a further 1 pound increase in the body protector allowance, which was renamed the safety allowance because our hope is that jockeys would have been safer. And we saw a huge response to that initially. To the jockeys used that additional weight really sensibly. However, 5 years later, we know that what the jockeys in Ireland anyhow did with that 3 pound is either let their weight go up and continue to sweat it off again, or try to take rides at lower weights. So while I think our hope was that we would see a shift in the culture, my view on the saunas and on the evidence base that we have had at that time over many years around the safety issues, along with the obvious detrimental health effects, was also around we're never going to change a culture or shift how jockeys make weight while we are mandating every racecourse in the country has a sauna, because we're telling them this is what we think, once we regulate it and open it and encourage it. So the closure of the saunas was a huge decision, but it's not the only part of making weight. There were lots of jockeys who made weight without the sauna and continue to do so. But what we do find is, obviously anecdotally, and what the jockeys report to us is still ongoing significant rapid weight loss, and possibly not necessarily the rapid weight loss because they don't have the sauna on race day, but this prolonged from the night before in the hot baths and in their cars, where they are continuing to rely, for some jockeys, solely on dehydration methods to lose that weight. We keep a track in Ireland, just by chance, I suppose, our anti-doping samples, all of those samples are checked for the density or the urine-specific gravity. So basically, how concentrated is a urine sample? So just a snapshot of 300 samples across professional and amateur jockeys riding in Ireland every year. And we have this back to 2014. And in that 10 years, we've seen, now it's crude data, but 18% of jockeys were riding, of flat jockeys were riding in the severely dehydrated category, and that's down to 10% now in 2024. And for jump jockeys, it's gone from 13% of riders down to 9%. And that's focusing or honing in on the severely dehydrated category, because we probably all accept a mild or moderate level of dehydration. They're probably well accustomed to that, habituated to it. It's probably not causing them significant difficulties in terms of well-being and safety. And again, we'll revert to Rosie shortly on trying to put some science behind that. But that's still 1 in 10. So 1 in 10 jockeys in Ireland are going out there every day severely dehydrated. So I suppose the reason for this panel today is, do the individualised minimum riding weights help us try and get a handle on that cohort, that 1 in 10 who are continuing to do what we feel is unsafe practices, both for their health and for the safety. And the sauna is a second part of that does it play a role in some kind of regulated fashion to allow that to happen. And I might pass it on to Rosie, who's going to put a little bit of the science behind what we're trying to achieve.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. So I think, first of all, just if I start the slides up. Slides coming up. No slide. Right. So we got it. Okay, great. So I think the main challenge, if we go again big picture, just taking a step back, is that we know that population heights are going up, and this is a bit out of date now, but the trend is still that heights are going up, and you can see for different countries that it's going up at different rates. So there are different challenges for different countries, and within Ireland and the UK, that's a challenge that we're facing. If the jockeys entering the sport are taller and they're still being asked to do the same weight, then we're going to have problems for their health potentially. So if we look at it, and this is just a snapshot of the UK jockeys, and it's a very small sample, but we just had a look to see, is that what we're seeing with jockeys coming in? And if you look at the, not the dark red, but the lighter red ones, the ones on the left, the taller jockeys are the younger ones coming into the profession. And then as you go down, you've got the middle-age category, and then the over 35s is the shorter group. So it did appear in our sample, And this is medical weights taken at the GP. When they do every 5 years, they've got to do a medical to retain their licence. So these are not riding weights at the racecourse. It's not under pressure. This is with the GP in a medical setting. So we see that the jockeys entering into racing, and this is flat, are taller than their older counterparts. And if you look on the right hand, your right hand, the other one is the weights. The weights are going up. So if we look down at the lower one, this is for jumps, and it's a similar pattern. We're looking again at the red ones. The jockeys that are entering into conditional licence are taller than their older counterparts. And the green ones are the females, which is not such a big difference, but there's not such a lot of people in that group, because it's quite a small group in that sample. So we need to update that and see if that's still a current problem. But that is the challenge that we're facing, is the weights haven't changed. Then you've got the research that comes in and says, are we asking for something that's realistic? Are the weights too low to attain in health? So George Wilson looked at 32 jockeys and took body mass composition measurements. And out of 32 jockeys, only one was deemed to be able to get to the riding weight that they would be allowed to ride at, their minimum weight, in the claiming structure. Only one of them could do it within the remit of being healthy at a minimum of 2.5 kilograms, which is really the minimum to retain health, and is still quite low. And 22 out of those jockeys of the 32 group were dehydrated as well. And just going back to what Jennifer was talking about. So is the ask realistic? Is it fair? Can they maintain their health within that remit? So as Paul was saying, we're running 3 projects in the UK at the moment, and in Ireland collaboratively. The first one is the independent scoping review that has been completed. The second one is the sauna, it's known as the sauna study, but the sweat study, which is the sauna-induced weight loss effects on aerobic strength and reaction trial. Thanks, Jerry, with the long title. But it is what it says, and that one is in progress at the moment. And the mental health study, which is Waterford, and Kira and Katie are doing that with the IJF as well, and funding that one. So they're all collaborations with universities and with stakeholders within the industry, which is great because everyone's working together on them. If we do the independent one first, because the results are out for that, and that's due to be published hopefully soon, we wanted to see what the evidence was before we started putting in research projects to try and look for a problem. We had to see what's already in the evidence. And they found, as we expected, that there isn't much specific evidence of jockeys with sauna use in isolation for weight loss or for making weight. So they then expanded the search out, and then they looked at any athletes or recreational sports and saw what the usage of saunas were. And again, there wasn't that much detail. On the effects of sauna use for dehydration, it was mixed. So the one thing that did come out is that skills were affected, and that seemed to be across the board regardless of sports. So I think it was driving, and there was other sports involved as well. Skills went down. When you looked at the other parameters, things like balance, cardiac function, strength, or cognitive function, it was very mixed. Some said they were better, some said they were worse, some said there was no change. And you could look at what also came out is that the quality of the evidence wasn't great. So it was very difficult to compare because different measurements were used, and they may not have been sensitive enough, especially with the cognitive measures. They probably weren't sensitive enough to pick up a small change. So we used that to inform the sweat study, which was then we put a steering group together in collaboration with IJF, with Irish jockeys, and with Racing Foundation and LJMU. And we brought in the PJA, so Paul sits on the steering group, and we brought in jockey representatives from jump and from flat, and we've got jockey coaches on there as well. And we put out the proposed plan of what we were going to do, which I'll run through in a second. And then we took feedback, and we actually updated our within the scientific realms of keeping it robust, we updated the protocol that we were going to do for the study. So if I run through what that looked like. So we did 3 testing blocks. So the first testing block, we did the hydration test to check that they turned up hydrated. And then we put them into the sauna. We dehydrated them down to up to 5% of their body mass. And then they did a second testing block, which I'll go through the details in a second. Then there was a half an hour break for them to rest, and we were trying to recreate that gap as if they turned up and dehydrated at home and then turned up to racing and there was a gap, or they turned up and they were only riding light in the last race. So as best we could, without making it an even longer day, we tried to recreate that prolonged effect of dehydration, and then we did a testing block 3. So each of these testing blocks involved cardiac function tests. So there was echo, there was ECG, and there was blood tests. We then went on to do balance tests, and we used some of the tests that we use in our concussion protocol. We tried to make them more sensitive than the ones in previous research. We've got IMU sensors to do motion sensors on there, and we've got the force plates there for the balance. So we're hoping to pick up some more sensitive data on that. And then Danny from IJF did our S&C protocol, which is similar to their profiling. So picked out 2 of the tests that we used there to do their physical testing. Then we had the jockey coaches came in and did our skills, because one of the things from the steering group said it has to look as close as we can to racing. We can't do it on the track, but as close as we could. So they've got a simulated 3-minute race. There was one for flat and one for jump. And at the same time, Danny was doing the aerobic testing. So we pretty much covered all the bases that we could. And then they did a cognitive test on the iPad afterwards. So where we're at the moment is the testing has been finished. We might extend it for a couple of days, but we'll see where we go with that. But the testing has been finished. The analysis is underway. And we're hoping either the first or second quarter to be able to put some results together, and that will hopefully inform future decisions. And that's where we're at now.
Thank you, Rosie. I know, Peter, you want to come in a little bit later behind the next phase, I suppose. That there are so many questions coming out. I'd like to get a little bit further before I start, and I'm sure you have as many as well. Andrew, you mentioned there that the jockeys, you see a route forward, if you like, that the jockeys don't see unregulated sauna use, but that you still see a route forward. Why don't they see unregulated? What are they seeing that's a no-go area, if you like?
Well, yeah, that's the obvious question. The reason being is that there has been a growing understanding among the jockey population, based on everything that we're kind of seeing here, or the results of everything we were seeing here, the diet, the education, the psychological supports. So the riders are seeing that this isn't anymore. The majority of them are saying that this is no longer a situation of get in there, knock the hell out of yourself, and get out and ride. So I think there has been a significant development in their own understanding of what their body can do and take. But I think within that, and I'm interested to hear, that our concern is based on the sweat studies, and that's of course very important. It's an evidence-based situation. My problem with it is that even if the sweat studies show that riders are significantly affected as a result of dehydration up to a certain level, the problem with it is that if we don't allow it in a somewhat controlled environment on the racecourse, they're still going to be potentially doing it at home. And that's what we're seeing, and that's what's happening. So if we have a situation, and if we have a situation where the rider can, within his minimum riding weight, still be allowed to lose some weight within the guidelines of what is acceptable and healthy. And for example, like every health club you go to has a sauna in it. So it's not that there is a certain base below which it is obviously safe, and jockeys live differently to the rest of us. I understand that, but there is a place there, and I'm coming back to that sweet spot that I was talking about earlier, because what we're seeing is them oversweating and using bad practices in circumstances where Paul and myself collectively feel that there is a position there that we could get to with individual riding weights set for the rider, that they can sweat safely and in a controlled environment.
What does that look like? Scope that out from the rider's perspective, I suppose, how we could get to evidence-based individualised weights. In as simple terms as you can, I suppose, because I can imagine the detail will be the devil will be in it.
Well, you see, we already have it. we've had it since 2013. I accept it's only in Ireland, but there's a huge body of evidence there as to how to set a minimum riding weight. And of course that's going to need further adaptations, like all of the things that we're looking at here. But when we've already got studies, we've already got a system in place whereby you do your DEXA scans, you do your reviews, you do your all the various different things that are being done at the moment and set in those. And I'm quite sure Jennifer will and the other experts in the room will give further ideas as to how those studies and that setting can be elaborated or enhanced. But we have it already, and it has been very successfully engaged with our apprentices, such that those apprentices are now full professionals and qualified. So we're not reinventing the wheel here. There's a very good protocol already in place. And what I'm saying is that be extended out to our full professionals, because once you finish your apprenticeship in Ireland, you no longer have to be bound by that. But if the rider understands that by adopting this minimum riding weight and accepting the minimum riding weight, that he could then use a safe method of losing weight and weight control within the environment of the racecourse, that's a win for everyone, because you're going to a gold standard, I believe, and I think a lot of us would here feel that a individualised minimum riding weights is a very good place to get to for riders. We already have the basis for it. It's only a question now, I believe, of broadening that.
Paul, are you broadly in agreement there? Do you think your riders are in a similar place?
I do. It's really interesting because Michael said something that really struck me when he said that racing is a lonely sport, yet we're more disconnected than ever, post-COVID, social media. And you really see that in the jockeys' changing room. And everyone in this room knows that you couldn't create a profession that could be harder with all of the things that being a jockey entails. And their focus I've been back nearly 2 years now, and a lot of their focus has been around weight and saunas. And I fully accept that even if we can agree to a change next year around how they're able to manage their weight on a race course particularly, it won't fix the fact that my jockeys won't suddenly become millionaires overnight. They'll still be struggling financially. They'll still be working 7 days a week. They'll still be driving 70,000 miles in the car. They'll still be getting slagged off on social media, chronically abuse. And, but one of the... And it's only really coming to light in the last year or two, and a completely unforeseen consequence. So no one's at fault at all for this. Every generation bemoans the generation after them for something, and the jockeys are very good at doing that. The current new young jockeys they're not as good as they used to be, etc. But I think the gap between them now is bigger than ever, because you've got a generation coming into the sport who've had their education impacted by COVID. They're growing up communicating as well as living on social media. And being in this, and this is no justification alone to bring them back, and I'm not pretending it is, but the sauna was, when they weren't overdoing it in the sauna, from a mental point of view and from a communicating and connecting point of view, the sauna was somewhere that the jockeys connected with each other across the different generations of jockeys and with people that they might not otherwise communicate with or share problems with. And as Michael said, they just want to talk. And you go in the weighing room now and they're not talking so much. Again, post-COVID, they never used to be allowed their phones because they were banned, but now they are allowed them, and that genie's out of the bottle. So the jockeys know and accept, and there's an element of, this always sounds really condescending when you say it, but it is fundamentally what it is. There's an element of protecting them from themselves, and it is condescending by nature to say that. But if you can adopt an individual minimum weight, not just for the young jockeys coming into the sport, but for all of them, and it becomes complicated in the UK. We can't DEXA scan 380 jockeys. And if you DEXA scanned full jockeys who've been riding for 10 years, I actually wouldn't necessarily want to know what their official individual minimum riding weight would be. But there's probably almost certainly practical solutions as to how you could get even the senior jockeys bought in to an individual minimum riding weight. And yeah, there'd be a bit of quid pro quo about it in order to get saunas back. And they're aware as well that saunas won't come back as mandatory. I don't ever foresee that, where a racecourse will be told you have to have one. So look, and even if we get the saunas back with individual minimum weights, there'll be another issue that we'll still have to focus on behalf of them, because their lives just suddenly won't become easy. But I think where they are as a collective is being very open to individual minimum weights, as long as we can give them a bit of help on the other side.
Jennifer, I suppose what the comment that's been made about dehydrating for longer, that there might be an additional risk there. From your perspective, is that something you're seeing, worried about? Is it a worse or better situation, I suppose?
I think my years in physiology in Queen's University 20 odd years ago are way back there somewhere. But we know the harms of dehydration. Any medical healthcare professional in the room, it's the first thing you get checked when you go to hospital. It's the first thing anybody checks when you're unwell for any reason, is your hydration status. A lot of the worries or the concerns around the safety of the sauna is the rapid weight loss. So you are losing potentially a significant amount of weight in a short period of time, and however long it takes you to get your breeches and gear on and wet out, you are on that horse potentially 15 minutes after a significant volume of fluid loss. Going back to the physiology lectures, when you lose weight over a longer period of time, or after a certain number of hours, auto-regulation kicks in. So our bodies are very good at protecting ourselves. So they take the blood flow from the less important parts of the body and they restore that blood flow to the important parts of the body. And that's the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, and the brain specifically, where we might be concerned around cognitive function. I think the jockeys definitely don't worry too much about performance. They are very... the level of their physicality and how they can perform is immense. So even dehydrated, I think they still manage to perform, outstandingly well. But the reaction times and a jockey's reaction to that weight loss when it's done rapidly. So the downside for the jockey is they're dehydrated for longer. So that's not a nice feeling, as we know. The headaches, the feeling of thirst, the having to make the long journeys. But I don't necessarily see allowing someone to do that in a sauna over a very short period of time and 15 minutes later be partaking in what we've all agreed in this room today is one of the most dangerous sports that someone can partake in. And on that point as well, this is not an individual sport, so you don't go and race around the track here on your own horse. You race alongside 15, 20, 25, whatever your maximum field size is. So certainly from my perspective, the responsibility or the safety of all of those jockeys is under my remit, not just that one jockey who wants to dehydrate. So you cause an accident, you clip heels, you make a wrong decision, you are not only in potential risk to yourself, but to all those other riders. And I think we have to, acknowledge that there is a collective responsibility to everybody in the race, that every jockey is riding safely. And also, we're in a huge time of horse and of equine welfare. So I think also the responsibility when that horse, when your owner and trainer and all of the connections gets that horse as far as the races, they expect a jockey to be fit, free from injury, free from concussion, free from drugs and alcohol, and in a healthy condition that they can perform and be safe. So the stakes are very high, and they're very high in my perspective from the safety concerns. I certainly will acknowledge it's very refreshing to hear you're both Paul and Andrew Drews. I don't know how I ended up sitting in the middle of you, but I'm a little bit more reassured having heard your opening spiel that we won't need a referee. So yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, I hope that we get the evidence that we are looking for, because the sweat study is replicating that rapid weight loss as if it were on race day. So I hope that gives us the answers and gives us a level of dehydration that we as medics and regulators in the sport can be comfortable with. And at that point, it's then working out how we support jockeys to make that weight.
Before I get to one of the bigger points, Andrew, you obviously come from a legal background, and there's two ways you can look at this. One, if we come up with a minimum riding weight that on any given day a rider proves, you've given me this minimum riding weight, but actually I could have ridden a pound lower. My dehydration levels are absolutely fine. My body is slightly different, and I've just missed the winner of the Melbourne Cup. And he says, come on now, you've disproportionately restricted me. But the other side is that we do let a rider out that is dehydrated and they cause an accident and the sport is at risk. So is it a double-edged sword? Where's the bigger risk? I suppose we'll have William Maudlin tomorrow. We could carry this into him and it might be very telling. But you have the same background.
Yeah. No, obviously, very obvious points. It's in the first thing, dealing with the first aspect of it, you set me at a weight whereby I could have ridden lighter, and I think in certain jurisdictions in Australia, you're allowed go below the handicap weight, the bottom handicap weight in certain races. The minimum riding weight is not a once-off situation. It's set and it doesn't get reviewed. We already have a situation where the rider is reviewed on a regular basis. The apprentices are reviewed on a regular basis. And if he comes during the course of the year and starts out at the season, whatever condition he's in, and he is set at that, he is always open to come back to the medics to say, look, things have improved, I've got fitter, I'm healthier, I'm eating better, I'm participating in better exercise regime, etc., etc. I think I can go lower, and I think I'm still within a safe limit. He can be reviewed down. So it's a situation that he can be reviewed on a regular basis, or as often as he requests it, in some circumstances, I would believe. So that would be my view on that, and that's up to the rider to show that he can safely go to that lower level, if that's what he wants. In terms of the upper level, the risk doesn't go away because you've opened the sauna. In fact, I would say the risk is greater, potentially, because there is no saunas where there was a sauna previously. I'm now going back to old methods which are not safe or less protected, and potentially I'm creating a greater risk for myself by that. So I'm looking at a situation whereby, and I'm not talking about, and Paul and myself are very much ad idem on this, we're not looking at a situation where the rider's going in and knocking off 5 or 6 pounds. We're looking at a situation whereby once he does not try to drop below his minimum riding weight, he is allowed to lose on race day at the race course, whatever it is, a maximum of 3 pounds, for example, or whatever the limit we ultimately come to, depending on these studies. So it's not a question of going in and killing himself on the day. We already know that his minimum riding weight is above what he's trying to lose, or is below what he's trying to lose in any event. So he's not going below that, but he is getting there to the race course. He's losing that last pound, 2 pounds, and he's doing it in an environment with his peers, those ones that he's going to socially interact. There's a lot of positives potentially that can be taken from doing this. Once, as I say, we can hit that sweet spot that's safe for the rider as well.
I'll come back to you on that, Rosie. Go ahead.
If I could just pick up on a couple of points. So just mentioning, sorry, Andrew, but just mentioning that we have a way of working out what the minimum weight was. We don't have a way, to my knowledge, of working it out, and there would be different ways of calculating it, which might help on the legal side. So the sweat study is trying to find out, do we go on a percentage of body mass? Then how do we define what the body mass is? It fully hydrated body mass? And then there are a number of questions that come along with that. How often we test for that. If we do a DEXA scan or skin folds, it needs to be something that we can do on an ongoing basis, and we can maintain and we can review appropriately with age, with growth, with all the different factors that come in. So there are a lot more challenges to working out how we define what the individual minimum weight should be, and it would need to be robust enough that it could face questions from legal teams that it was set too high or too low. It would need to be backed up with science, which is hopefully the purpose of the study. We might not base it on percentage of body mass loss, we might base it on pounds. So we might base it on your height or your BMI, but we don't know yet, and we don't know where that sweet spot is of. Some jockeys say that they feel a bit sharper after losing a bit with dehydration. We don't know where the sweet spot is of, do you get sharper and then there's a cut-off point. We're looking at health performance, and we're looking at physical performance. So it might be that they're compensating with other methods and their physical performance, and they're racing well and they're winning races, but they're doing detriment to their heart or to the blood markers or any other health factors that we've got, and the responsibility as the jockey as a whole, not just they look good, so crack on. So that the idea of how we define what their individual minimum weight has to be based on science, and it's not there yet, which is what we're trying to do. The other point you mentioned about whether they would be able to do, I mean, there always will be a question of you set it too high, you set it too low, but we need to be able to back it up from a regulator perspective that this is why, and it was even across the board, and we need to be able to justify why we've done it and how we review it. The other big point is that they would be able to, in theory, the floated idea is they would have a minimum weight, and then they'll be able to go, for example, just off the cuff percentage, 20%, of their races would be able to go below it, again, to a bottom cut-off. But that would be restricted to certain races. If they wanted to race in Chelmsford or a big meeting, they could use that as one of their below their minimum weight with the absolute cut-off. So that's the safety feature in there, and a bit of a caveat. We don't know what it looks like. We're trying to map out what it would look like and the challenges that come with it. But the last point I'd like to just pick up on as well, if you don't mind, is the jockey coming back to say they want to review. One of the important factors is to safeguard the jockey from being pressured into taking a weight that they wouldn't feel comfortable with but don't feel confident to say they don't want to. So if we can put a weight in that we can say they can confidently go to the trainer, to the owner, to whoever potentially is putting pressure on, I'm not allowed to take that ride because it's below my minimum weight. We've just safeguarded them from another factor. So I'm not sure that having them coming in to challenge the minimum weight would be a helpful setup. But yeah, there are a lot of questions logistically and science-wise to answer. We're just trying to muddle our way through and try and get to a place where we can safeguard their health and performance.
Peter, at this stage when we are searching for answers, I'm going to go to the Southern Hemisphere, and unquestionably the most difficult question of the day. Have you any of the answers to help us? Or perspective, indeed, joking aside, perspective from the Southern Hemisphere, please.
I do, and I think I really want to raise that there is a big risk here if we're looking at individual minimum riding weights, that all the weights will start to come up, right? So at the moment in Australia, we've got a minimum riding weight of 54 kilos. But if we start looking at minimum riding weights for individual jockeys and they start being 55, 56, 57, then is the ceiling of the maximum riding weights going to go up also? Paul touched on the fact that trainers will not be and are not happy with those weights going up, and Jennifer touched on other welfare risks, but there are competing and conflicting welfare priorities on the racehorse side of these weights. So any policies that are made of the jockey weights will directly affect the racehorses. There are a couple of studies that have gone out, one on national hunt horses in the UK and one recently by our group in Australia, that have shown that increasing weight carried did not adversely affect jockey outcomes in terms of falls and injuries. I know they have in some other studies, so there's some conflicting studies. But they did increase the racehorse injury rate. So for every about 1 kilo extra weight carried, the risk of racehorse injury increased by about 10%. So there is a direct, there will be direct repercussions of this if we start to bump weights up, and I 100% acknowledge that we need to manage the welfare of the jockey as well, but they do go hand in hand. It's it's not changing one won't affect the other. It's that they will both affect each other. But I do like that in the UK and Ireland there's more evidence-based approaches going towards trying to figure out how to solve this problem. In Australia, we've been very, very reactive. I think we only have saunas, right, in Victoria. They're not across any other parts of Australia, and that was partly because of, or mostly because of Peter Cook's heart attack that occurred in the early 1990s, and then 10 years after that, a decade after that, ACT Racing Club were sued for a significant amount of money, over $1 million, and the reactive approach was just to shut saunas down on track. So I'm all for evidence-based approaches, and then also considering that the more One Health approach, that the jockey and the horse are a partnership. They go hand in hand, and putting a policy in place that affects one will almost certainly affect the other.
Paul, I'm intrigued to know, you mentioned at the outset the riders' feedback was positive in terms of actually shutting them before the weight change. What was behind that? Was it just the reach for the weight change, or do the riders get that there is an undercurrent, there is an underlying risk? What would have driven the 84% towards closing them before we get into the other side?
Hopefully the research from Waterford will flesh some of this out in a more substantive way than my general method of just coming up with conclusions based on chats with a few jockeys. But I think that effectively what COVID allowed them to see, and I've had a couple of conversations over the last 2 days, that you will find that when you speak to jockeys after they've transitioned from being a jockey into their second career, that they're able to reflect on the things they had to do when they were a jockey in order to be a jockey, and reflect, God, I can't believe I used to do that. And what COVID, I think, allowed was jockeys, whilst they were having that kind of temporary break from racing because it was forced upon them, to reflect on what they were doing prior to it. So obviously, saunas had been closed, they got £3 allowance. They weren't allowed to take 4 rides at Salisbury, then get in the car and drive 3 hours, breaking the speed limit around the M25 to Newmarket to ride 4 more that evening. And they weren't able to do it. And I think it allowed them to reflect on, yeah, we shouldn't be doing it going forward. And I think it is a shame that I completely understood the trainers were cross about the allowance, but the irony being that because the weights were increased by £2 within the structure of the race, and because the jockey's safety allowance went from £3 to £4, these horses ended up carrying exactly the same bloody weight that they were carrying when the jockey had a personal £3 allowance. So we've been through all this kind of for nothing in that regard. But I think I think where they are now, because they are obviously, I think the biggest challenge is you're lying in the bath at 10 o'clock at night and you know your alarm's going off at 4:30, 5 in the morning, and you're going to be riding work. And then if you can squeeze in another half hour at home in the bath before getting in the car in your sweatsuit with the temperature turned up to then get raced. And this isn't every jockey every day, obviously. But I think they are now in a position where they can see what it was like with the COVID allowance. And they can see what they did before, and they don't want to go back to what they were doing before. They just would like their lives to be made easier, but they're also not asking to be going back to being really unsafe. So it's why this study is hugely important, and I just hope that it gives us the results that we want. Otherwise, I might be out of a job come this time next year, and I've already lost the job once. It'll be a record. It'll be a record to lose the same job twice.
Yeah, I'm just caught by what you're saying there in relation to the riders and how difficult they are to. I mean, you both have to represent riders, and many riders, when they've retired, give you a retrospective truth, if you like. It's like, now that I look back. Now that I look at what I did on many different fronts, if I had known, I wouldn't have done it differently. So are you caught in the middle of what you believe is the right thing to do for the riders and what the riders want on many fronts? And are we as an industry caught by dehydration is safe or it is not safe, or it's safe to a level? And below that is not safe. Andrew, thank you.
You see, they're not looking to go back to where they were. That's the point. Absolutely. We'll all hear these horror stories of what they did to themselves. And we all know it. I mean, you killed yourself to try and do it.
Didn't work.
You did, though. I mean, I remember it. So, but they're not, we got to understand, they've changed, I believe that they've changed their mindset to a large extent. And they're not looking to go back to where they were and that you'll have these horror stories again. They accept that there's got to be changes. They accept that they're not going to go to where they were previously, but it's getting to that place whereby they're not sitting in the bath at all hours of the night and up all hours of the morning. and that they have the option to lose that last £1, £2, £3 perhaps within the safe zone of their minimum riding rate. So
Let's scope that out, because we are dealing, and we will talk about it for 2 days, with the ultimate risk taker. And any risk that we saw downstairs is far greater than a little bit of dehydration to them. They deal with real risk that most of us will never really understand. So how do we protect them when they go to the track, and our industry from what might come of it, from the rapid weight loss of it not being 5 or 6 pounds? Get in a little bit to the detail of that, because that's probably where I get a bit, or maybe you've thought about it, Jennifer, I don't know, but the detail of trying to get riders to manage saunas, is it staffing and dealing with them as they arrive? I mean, I don't want to go too deep into the weeds, but it seems worth doing, because it seems a huge effort to get what we might like to get to anyway, but perhaps it's worth it.
I think when we, hopefully through the evidence, get to a point where we feel comfortable as to how we medically would set a minimum riding weight, and I think when we take that to the jockeys, they may not be as favourable as you think they are on stage today, because I think it will rule a lot of rides out for certain jockeys who are, are prolific sweaters, if you want to call them that. And they are a small number, but they are a significant enough number to cause us concerns. So I think when we get to the point, are we going to be comfortable in the compromise? So can we look back over the last couple of seasons to what are not the jockeys' lowest weight they rode at, because we would have no sense of how they got there, but to what it appears they are comfortable with. Look at what we are comfortable with, or what we believe is their minimum riding weight, and possibly to get the buy-in we need to consider a form of compromise there on both sides. But setting a minimum riding weight, while for me is, as Andrew called it, the gold standard, it's not without its challenges. We know with the apprentice group that we have, and we've just reset all of the weights here with Gilly O'Loughlin, who we heard from earlier, and we know that they are still, a proportion of them are still turning up in that severely dehydrated category, even with the minimum riding weight. So in some ways it's not dissimilar to when we give them a weight increase. When a rider comes to get his minimum weight set, they are on best behaviour. The month or 6 weeks beforehand, they do everything right, and they get the weight to where they need it to be to get the minimum riding weight set so that they can accept rides. And actually, Megan put it very nicely earlier when she said they're walking around weight, or they're walking weight, not their race weight. To stay at their race weight for an entire season, and for most of, well, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, there is no off season. So to stay at that minimum riding weight for the entire season, it's not sustainable. So inevitably, they let the weight creep up and they continue to sweat it off again. And how a rider makes that minimum riding weight does matter. So if it's £2 a day, and a lot of the jockeys will say they're very comfortable with that, some of the positives that came out of closing the saunas, because they weren't able to do that massive rapid weight loss, after which their weight yo-yos for weeks afterwards, and they can never stabilise. A lot of jockeys will report that their weight has stabilised. They wake up every morning, they've £2 to take off. If that's where the sweet spot is, when the research is done, that there's a certain number or an amount of weight or percentage, whatever way we work it out, that's safe, wouldn't it be great to allow them to do that at the races, to have the security to come racing, not to have to turn the heaters up in the car? But for the guys who are in the bath the night before the morning and the heaters in the car, that's more than £2 or 2%, whatever we get to. So they are almost certainly a cohort going to turn up to the races having already lost £3 or £4 at home, and now we're allowing them to lose the last £2 in the sauna, and that's what we are responsible for. I can't regulate what they do in their cars. So I think there has to be a massive step up in the accountability from the jockeys and how they handle this process. And I'd be really cautious about holding the carrot. Well, if you do this, we'll open the saunas, because that's a dangerous road to go down. We absolutely know, and it's not anyone's fault, but it comes back to the culture. The culture is that they sweat. I had a very senior jockey in the UK, and that was just his mantra: we're jockeys, we sweat. End off. And it's not helpful when that happens. And we still know, I'm not picking on the UK jockeys, but your champion jockey was recently in Ireland doing a huge promotion of his new book. And, he was openly telling how he lost £10 in 48 hours. And he said, I didn't feel too good. So we know this is still happening. As soon as we open the saunas, again, we're not changing the culture of telling and encouraging jockeys, it's grand, you can just come into the sauna. If we can get the buy-in that it's for the £2, and then we get all the wonderful health benefits. John spoke about it earlier, you spoke about it, the social side of it. There's no, I think some of the, particularly the media portrayal back home has been, that the RGB and the BHA are in a box room under the stairs and don't know anything about racing. And I think that has been unfair as to how it's been portrayed in a lot of the media. And I've welcomed this opportunity today to hear you speak and to try and get some of our side of the story across. This story doesn't make for good headlines. We're not going to hear the science in the Nicola podcast, but you will hear the jockey saying how awful my life is. We go back to the 2019 mental health study. Life wasn't, and I'm really refreshing to hear you acknowledge that today, that reopening the saunas is not going to take away the grind that these jockeys face. I've actually completely forgotten what your original question was, Richard, so I'm sorry.
No, that's good. I'm about to court questions from the floor now anyway, because I'm conscious time, as I thought it might do in this session, has rolled along pretty quickly. Before I do, so have your questions ready. Peter, I know you'd like to come in at this point.
Yeah, and just quickly, and I think part of this can start at day one, right, when we're recruiting the apprentices, and I know that is happening across the board. But we are seeing a massive shift in Australia on our male-female apprentice ratio, right? So last year we had 11 apprentices admitted. 10 were female. We had just one male apprentice. Our entire apprentice ranks at the moment are about 3/4 female. I think there's 40 apprentices, 31 are female of all the apprentices currently licensed. That all started to shift in 2015 when Michelle Payne won the Melbourne Cup. We had about a 50-50 male-female apprentice ratio, and that's just really in the last 10 years really upped its ante. So, women are generally smaller and can possibly make some of these weights more, but I think if we're thinking, day one, we might not be able to change some of the behaviour and the way the older generation and the senior jockeys are riding, but we can certainly start to think what will it look like 10 years ahead if we start with day one on who we're admitting into the apprentice ranks right now.
You've got to my final point, which would have been around selection, because it seems to be almost exactly the most logical thing that we can do. I mean, I remember as I grew up, Lester Piggott was the hero, and he was the big, tall jockey. And there's a statue of him now outside the Curragh, and he's not that tall at all. But if you look at jockeys nowadays, I remember being at a race meeting in Tipperary once, and Dr. Adrian McGoldrick was there doing testing, and all the riders walked out, and he said, look at them. He said, if they're going out for a rugby match, you'd give them a chance. But that's where we've got to. We've got to a cohort of riders. I mean, it might sound blunt, but there's a certain type of person who simply won't make it at basketball, so you don't ask them to come. And there may come a stage where the selection process will have to be to fit the profile. But look, we need to hear from the floor. I think there's a lot of views on this, and I'd welcome them because time is moving very, very quickly on this one. Thank you. We'll definitely get the microphone to you, because I know the question, it won't be heard unless we do. Thank you, Sarah Jane.
I did want to be a basketball player. I only made 4'11", so...
I wanted to be a jockey, Pete. We'll talk about it later. Shattered dreams.
So just in regards to the saunas at the tracks, I personally would feel more comfortable jockeys being medically managed for weight stripping than if they were doing it at home. We have got more control, I feel. Yes, we can educate them, but as you said, we've got to kind of protect themselves. Because I have seen jockeys losing 5-7 kilos leading into the races, and they've been doing it day in, day out, and they're professional jockeys, which is well beyond 2%, which is the AIS's recommendation to say intervene at 2% dehydration. So, and that is well beyond the 2% level.
I can speak from the medical side, and I have, like many of our colleagues here who work in race, I have carried apprentices and senior jockeys out of the saunas. I have carried them in out from the parade ring, and my concern is as many more didn't collapse before they got on the horse and managed to make it through that race. And we hear the jockeys telling the stories. And before COVID, when they weren't afraid to talk about this, they wore it like a badge of honour. I didn't remember anything from I got legged up till I got home that evening. I was so dehydrated. I see it when you pick them up off the ground and you go, goodness, it's not like this person to react, or there's no obvious injury. And you look at their eyes and you go, well, how much did you lose? And it's 7 pounds. So I think I have some issue with it. It's safer because the doctors are there to help us. You don't crash your car outside the hospital because it's safer because you're close to medical help. So I have some issue with that. I also have issue with and the jockeys like to use this a lot in the media, that someone's going to get injured driving the races like this, but they don't draw the line between you're going to be on a horse like this. Why is the risk greater for you driving your car and you don't see a risk when you get on horseback? So that safety concern is there. So I think I 100% take what you're saying, Megan, and I think that's where the sauna use has to be regulated, that we put a limit to how much a jockey can lose and hope that we get some buy-in from them.
I'd just like to say to Andrew and Paul, I understand your challenges with your members. I run the Victorian Jockeys Association. We do have saunas, but we have it regulated. You can only use the sauna for 15 minutes at a time, and every rider has to do a sauna course before they are able to use the saunas. So it's a challenge, but I do think that if you can manage the period of time jockeys are in the sauna, it's certainly a safer environment than what it would be if they were in the cars or doing that sort of stuff. So,
could you give us a little more detail on the regulation as you see it? I mean, if I arrive at the races, irrespective of how much weight I have to lose, what do I have to do? Do I have to check in with anyone? Is there dehydration testing, weight testing, regulated weights? Give us a little bit of the detail, because that's
there is a sauna supervisor at every track.
So I check in with them, presumably?
Yeah, 100%.
And weigh in with them?
No, you don't have to weigh in with them, but you can only spend 15 minutes in the sauna. So Totally, per session. So you're in the sauna for 15 minutes. You can't physically lose more than a pound in 15 minutes. You probably couldn't lose that much anyway. So,
and then you're out for
half an hour.
Half an hour, 15 minutes
half an
again.
Hour. Yeah.
Okay, and that's the way it's right. Is that the sort of model that you're heading towards? Either or.
There's many parameters you can put into this, Richard, to be honest with you. There's as many as you need in terms of protecting the rider as well as allowing this. So I'm not saying it's limited in scope to just being weight or just being time. It can be a bit of both. But what we're constantly hearing is that last 2 pounds that I needed to lose, if I could do that at the races in a supervised fashion, not below my minimum riding weight, that would make my life a lot easier and give me the benefits that we've talked about earlier, the social interaction that comes with that situation as well. That's where we need to try and get to. And I think that's going to enhance the lives of those riders. In some ways it may sound simplistic, but it could be a combination of a lot of these parameters that we've talked about here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are, and we have made progress. The sticking point in my head is that there is a level that is not safe. And we don't know what the riders have done beforehand. Unless you tell me different, I'm not sure that you've got to that level of detail. You've got your 15 minutes. So if we really want to be safe, and I'm twice as fascinated to listen to William Audlin tomorrow, if we really want to be safe and we want to regulate it thereafter, is it not the sauna is a sideshow, really? Am I wrong? Is it not the dehydration, really? And knowing that when we send 12 riders out here behind us, that those 12 riders are safe to ride, irrespective of how they got there. Is that not the underlying point here? And if it's in the sauna or with the good practices that we've talked about, it feels like that's going to be the real problem when Rosie's finished with her detail. But that's where I wasn't expecting to get to today. But that's where I've got to anyway. Yeah,
sorry, and I don't. There's really good people here, very clever people. But I think with the greatest respect, I think
that's never good. When somebody starts with the greatest of respect, you're about to get it somewhere here. But it's okay. We got to 1:45, which is the finishing time, before I'm about to get it. But Andrew, it's all yours.
With the greatest of respect, we're skipping the piece there where you've set the minimum riding weight, where you have that individualized riding weight. So his opportunity at home to kill himself and then come and lose 2 pounds. That's the big concern.
I actually, with the greatest of respect, I actually wasn't, because is it not the case from what we saw in COVID, when the riders went up, that they could crash back down to their minimum riding weight? So if I let myself go, we see all these riders that, we all know riders who find it a little bit more difficult, and sometimes it's get away on them, and they have to crash to a weight that would have been fine a year ago. So that rider could be unsafe. I just think underlying, my concern here, as somebody comes from an administrative side of things, and working from Horse Racing Ireland, I'm aware of the cost allocation to racing, And I worry on every level that the dehydration, the level of safety, the amount of work we might have to do to identify it, and the cost of keeping on top of it, it feels a little bit like a train coming down the tracks.
I might just come in there. I think probably that there's going to be a lot of work needed on this. I think if we set an individualised minimum riding weight, that's the first step to get across the line if we find a way to regulate saunas. But I think the monitoring of that, so I think a time limit is probably going to be involved, but I think there's also going to be regular testing where we show up on random days and check the jockey's level of hydration to see how much of your cohort are sticking to what we've agreed and not arriving at the races already dehydrated to further dehydrate. And that's where we're going to need the jockeys to step up and take some responsibility. So I don't think it'll be, well, this is what we're going to do and just rock on. I think it's going to take a lot, and there'll be trial and error, and I think a lot of patience required from everybody till we find a spot that, whether it's time, whether it's weight, how often we're testing. And for the regulators in the room, this is going to cost a fortune to regulate sauna use and set minimum riding weights. So
that's the metaphorical train. Michael, sorry, Michael, I see you have the microphone.
Yeah, I apologise for that, but
I believe you.
I didn't realise how much this meant to me until I listened to this again today and be at this brilliant conference. And it is a brilliant conference. I've been to many which aren't. This is. I just wanted to make 2 or 3 points, if I may. Going back to my work and research, was the jockeys actually stated they performed quite well when they were doing quite light. They liked being tuned up. Like a boxer, like a footballer. I work in soccer a lot now, and when a player feels right, that you know they're going to play like a lion. So they didn't mind being light. I think that was the first point to get across. Secondly, and this has just come to me, if this is the future, I think we're in good hands, because the level of debate today and discussion is the most rational, intelligent, measured I've ever heard around the most emotional topic of all, which is weight loss. Because weight loss, if we all become 6'6", weight loss will never ever go away. The second point was COVID. I was working with 4 different sports teams in COVID, and I remember the news items saying, how will the players feel? How will the cricketers feel? How will the rugby players feel? How will the jockeys feel? Can I give you this quite privately and politely, because it's being filmed? They had the time of their lives, because the biggest stressor of all was taken away, which was competing. And I didn't realise how much, when you took that away, how chilled out they were for 78 days, both on a race course. I was the first one back into a COVID bubble in England, and it wasn't so much the bubble that got them down, it was the fact that they were being judged again, and they'd been judgment-free for 78 days. And I think, and I'll try and be brief here, it brings me to my third point, because this debate shouldn't be about the reopening of saunas or not. But I will make this point quite openly, is throughout my years, the sauna, when used correctly, and I'm sure it can be used correctly. I mean, it's going to cost billions of pounds. We need Hong Kong's money at this rate to research.
They found an extra 4.5 billion. So.
With the greatest respect, you should have done your homework there. And I can get away with that with you, Rich, because I can tell you're a good fella.
Much appreciated.
But the point I wanted to make here was, I can't tell you what a safe place that sauna was, because no one else went in there. The only person who went in there once was me, because I was interviewed for the job, fully clothed in a sauna. I think that's why I got the job, because I started probably boring them. But it was the safest place, where a jockey would go in there without being crude, no clothes on, you were completely stripped back to basics. And the level of conversation and friendship and support that took place in this mad sweat box was extraordinary. And if you can just somehow tease out the best bits of a sauna, I think you'll be doing them a long-term service in terms of communication, connection, because I'll give you this from football dressing rooms now and rugby dressing rooms, they are as quiet as churches, because everyone is online. Minutes after the match, they're online. You've seen the pictures on the Lions tour. The minute the final whistle goes in, they're online. And a sauna was a place where they could talk safely, and come out and carry on the conversation. So I hope you find the sweet spot, because I think there is a sweet spot. And that's in a safe place where they can just talk among themselves.
Yeah,
that's now point over. I've finished now for the day.
I'd completely agree with Michael on that. I think this is my 5th conference here, and I understand the need to be evidence-based, and I understand all the amazing work that goes on by everyone in this room. But I think too often we can get too caught up in chasing perfection, and we don't need to chase perfection. Like you were saying during COVID, when they got a £3 allowance, and I know on the one hand, they loved not competing, but even after they came back to compete, 84% of them were saying that mentally they felt better when they returned for the £3 allowance and racing one meeting a day. Back then, we didn't know what they did. We didn't know what they did at home in the bath, or those that have a sauna at home. We don't. So if we were, through a combination of an individual minimum weight and the return of saunas, if we were to allow saunas to return, if a racecourse wanted to put them in, and return in some form of regulated way, I have to be honest, I really struggle to accept that it's going to cost fortunes in order to regulate it. And I really don't see why we need to pursue a perfection that we didn't need before, bearing in mind the reason that saunas were closed was not because we knew the weight-making practices were unsafe, a lot of them, but it's not why they were closed. So I think if we've got to wait for the research, and all of this and might be in vain, but assuming the research is, there's an element of it where it might be safe or safer. I don't think we're ever going to be able to say that being dehydrated and riding at 40 miles an hour is safe, because we know it's not. But equally, unless we want to ban horse racing, that is the reality of what a jockey will be doing, is riding in a dehydrated state. I'd love it for the minimum weight to go up to 9 stone 7, but it's never going to happen. And even if it did happen, you're just going to bring a proportion of bigger human beings into the same problems that our current population has. So I think if the studies tell us the appropriate evidence that it's safe, I think where there's a will, there's a way. And I think hopefully there's just a will on all sides, because I think we've managed to get the jockeys to a place where they're open to the individual minimum weight. So I think we've made a lot of progress over the last 6 months, a year, and it's just hopefully trying to finalise it.
I think we might have one more question. I'm very conscious of time. Is there somebody there? Oh, Tom, yes. Tom Scudamore. Can you shout, or do you need a mic? Oh, you have one. Good,
yeah.
Good.
Just talking from a point of somebody who spent hours in a sauna. And I understand what everybody's talking about, but they were some of the most miserable days of my life. And when I was doing lightweight, I didn't want to speak to anybody. It wasn't a case of being a safe place. It was a necessity. And I'd spent the night in the bath before, and I'd gone for a run when I got there. And as I got older, I could manage my weight better. And you learn from the mistakes you've made. I personally think the saunas are a red herring. And my argument has always been the weight structure. The weight structure all over the world has to change, in my opinion. Now, that has to be in balance with horse welfare, but obviously the data we're all taking together. But that doesn't paint the whole picture. So obviously the country I know in Great Britain, I only know imperial weight. So 8 stone 2 pounds, that doesn't tell the whole picture. There's young gentlemen having to claim 10 pounds off that. So it's £7.6 is the minimum weight. And 7 stone 6 pounds. And to me, it's the structure that needs to be looked at with the evidence-based scenario, because if you bring the saunas back, however much you're going to regulate them, you're never going to be able to control them. And I've seen the horror stories I can talk about. I've seen gentlemen collapse in them. I've seen people, one gentleman in particular, on Easter Day, he ate 7 Easter eggs in the morning, and he lost 7 pounds that afternoon in a sauna. And people sweat at different times and so 15 minutes in the sauna, Tony McCoy could lose 1.5 pounds in that time. Myself and Richard Johnson would lose 1/4 pound. Where's the fairness in that? But the fairness is, if we're all as a world and as a population growing, then there has to be evidence-based behind that. And for that, the weight structures, in my opinion, have to change.
Thanks, Tom. It's a useful insight, a huge insight to get the jockey's perspective, I think there are any number of talking points we'll take from this. The selection of the riders, the weight structure, where we can regulate weights using the evidence. Rosie, we're going to be waiting for that release. I think Nick Luck is going to be all over that one. But if I could, I think my wrap, and I think Michael did it for me, we have another. Yes, one more. This is the last one.
I'd just like to say, if we're talking about evidence-based recommendations, the United States, we've had an equine injury database for several years now. There's no correlation between weights, increasing the weights, and breakdowns of horses. In fact, the last 2 years under HISA, breakdowns in the United States have gone from approximately 2 per thousand to 1 per thousand. And in that time period, the racetracks have increased some of the riding weights. So if we're dealing with evidence-based recommendations, why is the onus on the jockeys or the regulators here to prove that the jockeys need to increase instead of the horsemen that are arguing that the weights can't go up? Where's their evidence to base their recommendations to not increase the weights?
I think that's something we'll pick. Do you want to take it now, or we'll get into it in injury surveillance as well? So you probably should take it now, but we'll certainly get into it tomorrow as well, Peter.
Yeah, and I'll just be brief. We didn't find an association with racehorse fatalities either, but non-fatal injuries in racehorses, we did find an association. So that would check with the studies done by Park and you and Bennett haven't found that weight carried was associated with fatalities, racehorse fatalities, but it certainly was with racehorse injuries. So there's probably some disparity there.
And well worth looking into. Look, as I was about to say, I think Michael's wrap did it for me, which is, I think with the collaboration of the people who are at the coalface of this, the will to get it done, we mightn't quite know exactly what it looks like, but I think we've a good chance of getting to it. And I think that's as good a way as we could have finished day one here. So if you're all happy to leave it at that, I want to thank you all for your attendance today. I hope those of you who suffer the 5K in the morning are able to be back here in time, same time again, and we've every bit as much to look forward to tomorrow. Thank you.